At that very time, they were also getting their budget cut. In fact, cut isn't really the word. Slashed with a machete and then bayoneted again and again and again. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'm Jason Clower. This is a channel about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons like the SKS carbine, and why it undervalued other weapons like the Type 56 AK. Long ago, I heard a story about one of the unsung heroes of the early PLA leadership, a man named Zhao Erlu, who held rank as a general in the PLA, but he only wore his general's uniform 3 times in his life. At his promotion ceremony, and for taking an official portrait, and at one other function, maybe a reception connected with his promotion. Other than that, Zhao Erlu was a man who worked very much behind the scenes. He was highly placed in PLA weapons procurement. He became, I believe, ultimately the minister of something called the Arjibu, the second machine building ministry, which was in charge of building China's capacity to manufacture its own armaments. As we've seen before, China was concerned from the very get-go about making sure that while they learned as much as they could from the Soviet Union and took advantage of arms purchases and technology transfers from the Soviet Union, they wanted to be able to cut the cord of dependence on Soviet manufacturing and supply as fast as they could. Zhao was one of the men who helped the PLA do that. This story concerns a trip that he made to Moscow in 1956 and a visit, I believe in this one, to the Izhevsk arsenal, Izhmash. And there, as the story goes, he was touring the facilities and preparing to buy for China a package of Soviet armaments technology, licenses and technical packages for a whole panoply of Soviet equipment that China could learn to make on its own back home. And in this version of the story that I was told, Zhao Erlu is going around through the Izhevsk arsenal, and he walks into a building where he's not supposed to be, and he sees there a production line making this interesting new semi-automatic carbine that he hasn't been shown or offered before for Chinese use. And he rounds angrily on his Soviet host and accuses them of hiding from their Chinese clients their best stuff. And in this version of the story that I was told, what he saw that he wasn't supposed to see was the SKS carbine, and he angrily demanded that the Soviets give that technology to China. This story, there is a kernel of truth to this. As far as I can tell, something like this did happen, but it did not have anything to do with the SKS rifle. For one thing, the Chinese signed the deal for the technical package for the SKS rifle on January 11th, 1955. This is very well established. By the time Zhao made this visit to Izhevsk in 1956, the Chinese were already well on the way toward manufacturing their own SKSs. There are some other problems with the story. For example, I don't think the SKS was a deeply held Soviet national secret in 1955 or 1956. I think that this story did actually happen, but it concerned other kinds of Soviet military technology, something more complicated, maybe mechanized vehicles or something, where the Soviets, they weren't exporting the very latest version. So this story is wrong in detail. It does indicate a few things that are going to be useful to us very soon. It is true, for example, that even at the height of the Sino-Soviet bromance during their honeymoon period, it was always the case that there were certain tensions between the Soviet side and the Chinese side. And the Chinese side it chafed under the feeling that the Soviets weren't like giving the Chinese students the very best that they had to offer, and several other problems. We'll talk about those soon enough. This story does also raise the kind of puzzling question that our course is really centered around. Since the Chinese adopted the Type 56 family at the same time, I mean, really, it was a found family. It's not like the SKS and the AK and the RPD were all designed as a family in the way that like the later RPK light machine gun was designed as to the service rifle. But nevertheless, given the fact that the Chinese adopted these 3 weapons at the same time, and they had the SKS and the Type 56 adopted into their arsenal at the very same time, Why then did they make the apparently backward-looking, quote-unquote, wrong decision of using the SKS as their service rifle and just reserving the Kalashnikov for specialist purposes? That's the founding question of the course. And from today's perspective, it requires a lot of explanation to justify this choice. So far in the course, I've been talking a lot about the SKS and what the PLA liked about that, and we've seen a few things. We've seen that they liked a classic rifle, that because of their military and tactical heritage, they really prized the art of marksmanship from a long range and from a kind of flat range perspective, that there were things that they liked better about the SKS than the AK-47. It was lighter, it had a longer sight radius, it was better at shooting single shots. They also found the AK kind of wanting in accuracy even in automatic fire, and they felt that the SKS was maybe a little more ergonomic than the AK, and so on. But up to this point, we've really been talking about what the PLA thought were the virtues of the SKS. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about the other side of the choice, namely why they really didn't give the AK what we modern people, with the benefit of hindsight, might consider a fair shake or a fair look. We've mentioned before that the PLA classified the AK as a submachine gun, and to the extent that they were interested in volume of fire at all, just going from a bolt action rifle that they were used to the semi-automatic capability of the SKS was already a considerable bump up for them in rate of fire. There's no indication that anybody had any hunger to go even higher by turning the AK into a service rifle. We have to remember that for the PLA High Command in 1955 Beijing, it's not like they've been visited by time travelers who say, I have come to prophesy to you that the future lies with something called an assault rifle, and you actually have one in your hands in the form of your own Type 56 AK submachine gun. Today, I want to go farther and try to push the thesis that it wasn't that the PLA was out of step with the rest of the world, that they were kind of lagging behind in time from the more advanced militaries. Today, I actually want to stress the ways in which actually the PLA was really kind of still in the mainstream of militaries of their day in not giving something like the Kalashnikov a serious look as a service weapon for general issue. And in a minute, to support them in that, I'm actually going to look at the US Marine Corps and the US Army and what they were saying at this time. But first, let me just encapsulate the situation that the Central Military Commission is in right now in 1955. As we've seen, they've adopted a war plan for defending against a US invasion that is going to do as much as they can in the direction of combined arms and attempt to fight a short rather than a long war. They're going to use as much technology as soon as they can. And they really would like to end the war quickly, but there's no good reason to think that they're going to be able to do that. So at the very least, they have to be very well prepared for the possibility that this war against the US that they see coming is going to last months and months, and that eventually their backs are going to be against the wall, and they're going to have to fall back on those old classic PLA skills. This involves what in that earlier video I was calling the foot mobile reserve that would come into play in a situation where the US had been penned up for as long as it could near their beachhead by whatever modern forces the PLA could bring to bear. And now finally they had broken out into the openness of the North China Plains, and they were maneuvering all over like hell on wheels. And now it was up to the old-fashioned PLA millet and a rifle guy in sneakers with a gun and a few cartridges to stop them. That was the situation that the PLA had to at least plan for. And it's also worth remembering that even under the best case scenario, if the whiteboard vision in Beijing of their new increasingly combined arms force came true with no budget shortfalls or anything like that, even under those idealized circumstances, the PLA was still going to be 85% infantry, down from something like 98% in 1949. So even if rainbows and unicorns broke out in the Ministry of Defense and gave the PLA generals and marshals their every wish, still, they were going to be a super infantry heavy force, and really that means light infantry. Now, before we go on, I should also mention that that's under the idealized circumstances that the marshals like really dream of in Beijing. I should point out now that vision had exactly zero chance of coming true. Because at the very same time that they were drawing up their white papers and making their diagrams on chalkboards about what the new modern combined arms force structure was going to look like, at that very time, they were also getting their budget cut. In fact, cut isn't really even really the word. Slashed with a machete and then bayoneted again and again and again, just as they're talking about how much they should put into trucks and towed artillery and how many tanks they could venture into buying and what kind of new semi-modern communication systems they might adopt. Just at that very time, the word comes down from the finance people that you have to stop spending the lion's share of the national budget. That didn't only mean fewer expenditures on fancy capital equipment. It also meant that in the infantry companies, uh, they were told, stop going to the range for live ammo practice. You're basically cut off from live ammo for training. Pretty tough for a military that aspires to be these long range crack shots who make every shot count. They're also told on your assault courses, you can't use real barbed wire anymore. We can't afford it. We have to shave pennies off this budget any way we can. So use rope to simulate barbed wire. The mechanics are being told to defer maintenance on the few vehicles that they have. They're also told to like literally wipe every drop of oil and lubricant they have out of every can. And even the rations of the riflemen get cut. The riflemen, who like were not fat guys to begin with, now get 5% less calories because budget. So you can imagine what that does to any fancy plans that they had in Beijing about like new boats or planes that they were going to buy for the Navy or Air Force, much less what it means for the land warfare branches getting any shiny, cool new toys. So this isn't like even two steps forward, one step back. It's sort of like one foot stepping forward and the other one stepping back at the same time. So one thing that that means is that small arms doctrine is more important than ever. We've said this before, that the PLA always relied on small arms for most of its lethality, but that's even more true than ever now. Or at least it's much more true than they wanted it to be when they started dreaming their dreams of advanced combined arms. It's like that old French saying, le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The modernizing PLA of 1955 is actually not that much different from the PLA Army of 1950. I mean, okay, that's an exaggeration, but what I'm trying to drive home here is the vast gap between reality and their ideal, when even that ideal situation was a huge compromise with reality and basically China's poverty and low starting level of education and military science and even literacy. So under these circumstances, the generals and marshals in the Central Military Commission are really paying, if anything, more attention than ever to these small arms acquisitions. Not only is this Type 56 family of small arms going to be the new backbone of the infantry, which is always the backbone of the PLA, in an army where small arms are always the backbone of their lethality. Not just that, we have to remember too that under the best of circumstances, it's going to take them years to roll these Type 56 weapons out, even to all of the frontline fighting companies. China starts to be able to manufacture over 1 million SKSs and Type 56s total a year. It takes them a while to get there, if I remember correctly. And even at that rate, it's going to take them a long time to replace all the old Type 53 carbines and all of the old DPs and all the old pistol caliber submachine guns. You might remember that in the video that we did where we heard from the veteran about the day that his company got their Type 56 weapons and they were just over the moon and they were the envy of the entire regiment. We have to remember that that story took place in about 1960, 4 years after the formal adoption, and they were a fighting unit. They had just come back from post-war garrison duty in North Korea. So they were far from some low priority second line regiment. No, no. So for the Central Military Commission, the CMC, it was going to be a big push to get these very important Type 56 weapons out to the companies in any kind of a timely fashion. Today we can take a little bit more of a look at why they didn't think enough of the Kalashnikov, even to really seriously consider whether they should turn it into the general issue service weapon. We've mentioned a few of these reasons in previous videos, having to do with marksmanship and the role of the submachine gun in the PLA, and their complaints about the AK. But there's more to it than that. One thing that people often say is, well, I bet that the PLA went with the SKS because it was cheaper to manufacture than the AK. Maybe not. Now, I haven't seen reliable documents about this, but all I can say is that based on information from people in China whose opinion I respect, and they certainly know more than I do, the word is that the per unit cost for the SKS was actually a little bit more than the per unit cost for the Type 56 AK. This source was saying for the PLA, for the Chinese economy, yes, steel was precious and expensive, but you know what was even more expensive? Wood. That wood furniture on the SKS cost a little more than steel just because, unlike the Soviet Union, which had these vast Siberian forests, China was heavily deforested and had been for, oh gosh, I mean, dynasties. So that if anything, from a production cost point of view, the SKS was just slightly more cost prohibitive than the Kalashnikov. Now, some people will then say, okay, but what if you add in the cost of the ammo? I think that that gets closer, but I think it's not so much the manufacturing cost of the ammo itself as it is simply the availability, like the ability to transport such ammo as you have out to the troops in the field, especially under wartime conditions. And at this point in the video, I'm going to begin to point out how the PLA was not alone in thinking this. We can actually find really good corroboration for the old PLA generals and marshals' suspicion of putting automatic firepower into the hands of the average infantryman from the US Marine Corps and the US Army. It was far from a bizarre or backward or third world military kind of an opinion. Let's look no farther than the US Marine Corps, whose Small Wars Manual was published in its final form in 1940. This was a manual about fighting what today we might call bush wars or counterinsurgency wars or low intensity wars. And it imagined situations where a relatively small unit of Marines might be operating. Historically, it was in Latin America and the Caribbean during what came to be called the Banana Wars. But a relatively small Marine unit might be operating outside of contact with friendly forces, maybe even out of contact with the US government or its military chain of command for some indefinite period. These units would be responsible for seeing to kind of to their own logistical needs in a way that they wouldn't have to in part of a large war scenario where you would have the quartermaster corps, or whatever it is, seeing to your every supply need. Because they were looking at fighting expeditionary wars with a lot of improvisational and ad hoc cadging of supplies and transport services and things like that. And also having to rely on their own devices for things like civil military relations. There's a chapter at the end of the manual about how to set up a military government, how to have an election. Just not things that are normally within the line of, say, company level infantry officer. They're forced to think about how they're going to fight and operate with the weapons that are organic to a rifle platoon. and a rifle platoon that may not have a resupply of ammunition anytime soon. In no particular order, the Small Wars Manual says some things about the employment of platoon weapons, and especially the importance of small arms and aimed rifle fire, that's going to sound very familiar to us. By the way, as I read these, my recitation is going to be slightly paraphrased. Note, I'm reading you ellipsed paraphrases. The verbatim quotations I've put in the show notes. This is because of my peculiar pedagogical philosophy. I won't bore you with it, but if somebody ever wants to hear about it, just ask me. The principal weapon is the rifle. The rifleman must have complete confidence in his ability to hit targets. And he must have the spirit of the bayonet. That's the desire to close with the enemy in personal combat. The rifle is the most important weapon. Other infantry weapons cannot replace it. The rifle is exceedingly effective in the type of firefight connected with small wars operations. Elsewhere, it continues, the conservation of ammunition should be stressed in all combat practices. And elsewhere again, ammunition supply is a difficult problem. Rarely can volume of fire replace accuracy of fire. The majority of an infantry patrol should be armed with weapons capable of delivering deliberate, aimed, accurate fire, rather than with weapons optimized for a great volume of fire. In today's plain English, that's saying because you can't count on ammo supplies, you must optimize your light infantry for aimed, precise, single shots, not volume of fire. Sound familiar? Yeah. Now, granted, this edition is being written in 1940, but it's not so long from 1940 to 1955. Sure, a little thing called World War II intervenes, but I hope you're seeing that the conditions that the U.S. Marine Corps sees itself fighting under at least some of the time, still in 1950s, and still in the modern Iraq War, when the Small Wars Manual was recommended reading for deployed Marine forces. These conditions that they're talking about are not limited to 1940. They're not limited to the 1950s PLA. These are still conditions that obtain throughout the life of the Small Wars Manual as a relevant military instructional document, which continues to this day. Now, if we want an even stronger statement than that, in favor of aimed single shots and against fully automatic rifle fire for the squad in general, let's go from the U.S. Marine Corps to the U.S. Army. In Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, we've bumped into him before. In World War II and Korea, he was a kind of celebrity military journalist and what I've taken to thinking of as a doctrinal influencer. Marshall writes in his book about small arms in the US military in the Korean War that the Korean data reaffirms substantially what a majority of infantrymen have long held to be true, that active and intelligent use of the rifle is the mainspring of sound company action. And let me stress further, it's definitely semi-automatic rifle fire that Marshall means to praise and extol. He does not want some assault rifle in the hands of the basic rifleman. Here's what he says against giving automatic fire to the basic rifleman. Any trend toward eliminating the semi-automatic hand-carried weapons in favor of full automatic weapons in the hands of all infantrymen should be vigorously combated. He's writing like it's, the marriage of cats and dogs, the calling day night and night day. It should be vigorously combated. In perimeter defense, the time almost invariably comes when the automatic weapons run short of ammunition. The semi-automatic weapons are conservers of ammunition. Apart from their great value in the hands of a good marksman in any stage of the fight, they compose the weapons reserve, which becomes of inestimable value in the last hours when both sides are near the point of exhaustion. So here, Marshall Army guy is actually going way farther than the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual. That manual was just about small wars, these ill-supplied expeditionary wars where you're freebooting in a strange land without much contact with friendly forces or most to the point, with your own ammo resupply. But in that quotation that I just read to you, remember, Marshall's talking about the Korean War, where the US was amply supplied by the US Navy and Air Force. And the US forces were practically made of trucks. That's important. I have this notion that the concept of the assault rifle really only enters its own as an idea that makes terrific sense for modern infantry combat after militaries become motorized. Field operations are totally different when they're motorized than when they're just supplied by foot, or I suppose by mule. It's much different if you're operating out of a truck than if you're operating out of a rucksack. I mean, just think about your own camping or hunting trips. Car camping is a different thing from backwoods hunting. In fact, even that is maybe not a fair comparison. If I'm camping in the boonies, I still drive there and park at the trailhead. It's not like I have to schlep all my stuff from my very garage out to the mountain. And yet, even though Marshall is talking about the US Army, he still says they should vigorously combat a trend toward automatic rifles as general issue. Why? Because they burn up ammo and leave you undersupplied. Okay, friends, so if SLA Marshall is talking about this from the perspective of the US Army, the most truck-borne, the best supplied army in the world. And even he says that the general issue of automatic weapons is going to result in incalculable wastage of ammunition. Maybe it's not crazy that a bunch of dirt fighters in Beijing in 1955 are still saying the same thing about an army that still can barely roll out a semi-automatic rifle to more than a fraction of its frontline troops. In other words, what I'm trying to do is normalize the PLA perspective so that we're not seeing it from our point of view in the 21st century, where even narco gangs wouldn't be caught dead with a semi-automatic only rifle. And trying to view them correctly, unanachronistically, by the standards of their day. And yeah, I get that the infantry board was looking at the T-44 and the T-47, but the point remains that even in the US Army, select fire was still a future concept. And as we're going to see very shortly, the PLA was about to get very busy with its own kind of bizarre analog to the M14 project. So I don't want to beat this to death, but the point of invoking Marshall, the American infantry soldier, and the USMC Small Wars Manual is just to say that if the PLA of 1955, with its almost unhesitating preference for the SKS and its passing up the Kalashnikov almost without a second thought, without really giving it what we might consider its due, an honest look at the Kalashnikov as perhaps a good general issue service weapon, if they seem out of step from our point of view, I just want to drive home that in their own time, they really were not that far out of the mainstream. Here we've got the USMC Small Wars Manual, a document that was still quite current in 1955, and SLA Marshall writing about the Korean War, fundamentally agreeing with the PLA General Staff that automatic fire belongs with specialists, that it does not have a place with the basic infantrymen. It does not belong in a general issue service weapon. That it's not only unnecessary, that it would be actually bad. It would consume more ammo than it could usefully use. And again, I can't stress this quite enough. That's not only coming from a Marine Corps expeditionary warfare point of view, it's also coming from Marshall, who's writing about a world in which, although on the one hand, 360-degree perimeter defense is the new norm in Korea, it's not like we have just a continuous line anymore, with every company tied in with its flank and in direct communication with the rear. Nevertheless, in Marshall's world, if you don't have pretty ready resupply of ammunition, that in itself is going to constitute an emergency. So what I'm trying to say is that even in the American military, we get as estimable a voice as Marshall saying, no, 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 no. Prizing aimed single rifle shots is not only an adaptation to expeditionary warfare where resupply of ammo is uncertain. No,
It's just good infantry fighting. And
it's dangerously wasteful of ammunition to hand out fully automatic weapons to any old soldier. You'll even find in the Small Wars Manual that it says the M1 makes the BAR obsolete. Now you'll notice it's talking there about the BAR without a bipod, so not really able to function as a light machine gun. But that's how sold the Small Wars Manual is on the superiority of the M1 Garand to an automatic rifle. In fact, it's even sort of like cute and pitiful because the Small Wars Manual was published in 1940 before the M1 was rolled out to the Marine Corps as its standard frontline weapon. The Marine Corps still has a limited number of them in service at the time of the writing of the Small Wars Manual. And so it actually says it'd be great to have the whole squad have M1s, and one day they will. But for small wars, we'd be happy just to have two M1s in a squad. With full auto out of the way, we definitely don't want something that crazy. What about the bayonet? One of the things that we've seen about the PLA's Central Military Commission was they really liked that the SKS had that nice bayonet permanently attached and that it made a good bayonet platform. For them, that meant that it was relatively long, longer than the Kalashnikov, and it was smooth. It didn't have the banana magazine getting in the way of, say, a bayonet thrust. So, what does the Small Wars Manual say? It loves the bayonet. It says, the bayonet is a very effective weapon when employed by troops thoroughly trained in its use. And specifically with respect to hand-to-hand combat, which is not a thing that they're really looking for, but happens to them when an underarmed force would prefer to sneak in close instead of having to charge out in the open and get walloped by the Marines' firepower. In hand-to-hand combat, the manual says the use of rifle fire in the general melee of hand-to-hand combat is fully as dangerous to friendly personnel as to the enemy. So the bayonet is the most satisfactory weapon to combat an attack of this nature, namely an ambush at hand-to-hand distance. So first, note that the Marine Corps is warmly embracing the bayonet here, even though their preferred tactic would be to hang back from an enemy and shoot them from a long distance with their excellent marksmanship. But that does not mean that they think the bayonet is obsolete for them. Far from it. Second, note what an equalizer it is. What the manual is describing there in Chapter 6, Section 76, is what it calls a bolo attack, where the Marine column is moving down a narrow forested trail and it gets jumped from both sides by dudes with machetes. Since everybody's going to end up enmeshed in hand-to-hand combat, it doesn't want you shooting your rifle and throughing a bunch of other Marines. So it urges bayonets. In that same scenario involving an ambush with bladed weapons, the PLA is picturing itself not as the Marine defenders, but as the ambushers who have managed to hide themselves successfully until they're inside the Marines' own formation. And so the Marines' gunfire isn't even an option anymore to protect themselves. That's great for the PLA. So what that means is the Marines are considering this ambush scenario that's very unfavorable to them. And they're still saying, yep, that just proves that bayonets are for us. How much more then for the PLA, who imagine themselves as the ambushers in that scenario, the beneficiaries of that ambush? For them, the bayonet just comes up aces. So again, if the Central Military Commission in 1955 in Beijing is embracing bayonets and saying bayonets are important, We really need to think through the choice of our service weapon to make sure that it's a good bayonet platform because bayonets are so essential to our way of war. That just means they are far from crazy. We have corroborating testimony right here from the Marine Corps. And the manual goes on, a night attack should be an assault only with the bayonet. That is, without preparatory fire, just a final assault using the bayonet. Indiscriminate firing by the attacking force in a night attack is fully as dangerous to friendly personnel as it is to the enemy. Well, who loves night attacks, friends? The PLA. And who says that bayonets are the thing to rely upon in a night attack? It's not just the PLA, it's the United States Marine Corps. Well, one cool thing about the Small Wars Manual for students of the PLA is it gives you a good textured feel in plain English for how it prizes versatile generalists in expeditionary warfare. Improvisation is a big deal. Your survival and success are threatened more by nature and scarcity than by enemy action. The Small Wars Manual says that. And yeah, there's a need for specialists here and there. The manual talks about how you can employ aviation assets if you have them, how you can employ watercraft if you have them and you need them. But they still have to be generalists first. Any officer who's going to be part of one of these expeditions has to know quite a bit, according to the manual, about, say, veterinary science and the care and feeding of pack animals. That's just one of many arrows that he has to have in his quiver. He has to be really kind of a Renaissance man of land warfare and sea and air, kind of. He has to be a generalist first. So why am I driving at this comparison so hard? Let's just take a step back for a moment and refocus on the 1955 adoption by the PLA of the Type 56 small weapons family. What do we know? The PLA is in a situation where it's trying to learn to fight wars in a more modern, more advanced, more combined arms, more technical way, but it still has to be ready to face everything. It still has to think like big army. And at the end of the day, it only gets to choose one service weapon for every squaddy in the whole organization. This is a big green machine having to make a one size fits all decision for its entire force. And what I want to underscore here is that even at that point, when the PLA is in the midst of its greatest modernizing mood ever, still, the big army perspective is the expeditionary war perspective, just like the one envisioned in the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual. Granted, the expedition in question is going to be in their own rural hinterland, not Nicaragua, but it's made up of the same conditions envisioned in the Marine Corps' Small Wars Manual. You're a small force, you're moving probably on foot, you're probably tenuously supplied at best, and maybe out of communication with friendly forces for an indefinite time. And you may also be numerically inferior to your foe. And you'll probably have little to rely on except for small arms and maybe a mule team or some boats. So, from that perspective, in 1955, by the standards even of the US Army, much less the US Marine Corps, the PLA was actually quite sound and reasonable in its decision making, and actually really not all that far out of the doctrinal mainstream. Given the information that they had in 1955 and the kind of inertial weight of land warfare opinion, not just in China, but also in the US military, we could really can forgive them for looking at the Kalashnikov and barely even recognizing it as a possible candidate as a general issue service weapon. And that's in 1955 when things in the PLA are actually fantastic. And it's almost like the high watermark for the spirit of modernization and catching up with world militaries in the PLA. They don't know it yet, but they are about to have the military tablecloth whipped out from under them. That's a subject that we're going to work our way up to in the next 2 or 3 episodes. But by the time it's over, the PLA leadership is going to, one, have had all its expectations about the kind of force it was going to become confounded, and two, their choice of the SKS over the Kalashnikov is going to look brilliant and prophetic in hindsight. For today, friends, this has been Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might even consider visiting our Patreon page. However, the course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. We have much more to come. It's still only 1955, and our story still, believe it or not, has 30 years to go because the career of the SKS in the PLA still has another 3 decades of life in it. So we have much more to come, and I can't wait.